Thank you, John. Okay, right. I think that's everybody. Close the door. Okay, so during much of the 18th and 19th centuries, if we were to have strolled down Commercial Street when the whaling ships were at anchor, we would have been guaranteed a very lively time. When the whalers lay in Bressa soon, Lerwick became one of the most notorious and riotous ports in Britain. This was certainly the experience of a Christopher Thompson, a young shipwright from Hull, a city not known for its restraint, who arrived in 1820, who noted in his autobiography, "At the time when the Greenland sailors called here, particularly on the passage out, these islands are kept in a state of fermentation. The retailers of whisky, the shopkeepers, fortune tellers, and the loose females, which even here are found in numbers, keep a sharp lookout upon the cash and whisky of the sailors." Now, today I'm not going to give you a lecture on loose women, or provide you with a general account of the course of the Arctic whaling. Rather, I'd like to explore what survives of this extraordinary industry, which employed so many Shetlanders over such an extended period of time. And in particular, I'd like to focus on surviving material, both tangible and intangible, which gives intercultural contact, which shows intercultural contact between Shetlanders and the Inuit, or Yakis as they were called, as this is the feature of the industry which most fascinates me. However, to begin with, it's worth considering some numbers, and this will give you an idea of the scale of and the impact on Shetland of the Arctic whaling industry. According to Sir Walter Scott, writing in his diary in 1814, it seems these ships take about 1,000 sailors from Shetland every year and return them as they come back from the fishery. Each sailor may gain from £20 to £30, which is paid by the merchants of Lerwick, who have agencies from the owners of the whalers in England. The whole return may be between £25,000 and £30,000. These Shetlanders, as they get a part of the pay on landing, make a point of treating their English messmates, who get drunk, of course, very riotous. Between 1755 and 1775, some 50 to 90 vessels a year were enlivening Lerwick on their way to the Davis Straits. This grew to as many as 253 vessels in 1788. The numbers dipped during the Napoleonic Wars, but soon revived. In 1808, 600 Shetlanders were involved as Greenland men, while by 1825, 1,400 Shetlanders were aboard 70 whalers. For comparison, the total population of Shetland in 1821 was only 26,145. It was Shetland's first oil boom, a whale oil boom. And even as late as 1874, after the Arctic fishery had passed its high point, there were still some 600 to 700 Shetlanders employed on the whalers. Indeed, for as long as the ships continued to leave Scottish ports for the shore stations of Baffin Island and the Hudson Straits, where seals and polar bears were complementing the catch, ships continued to stop in Lerwick. For example, in 1911, just 2 years before the last Dundee whaler left port for the final time, the Scotia sailed for Greenland with 9 Shetlanders out of a crew of 42. Why Shetlanders? Well, Shetlanders made desirable crew because of their seamanship. As Arthur Conan Doyle noted in his article, Life on a Greenland Whaler, which related to a voyage he made to the Arctic as surgeon on the Hope in 1880, which was published in the Strand magazine in January 1897, there were 50 men upon our whaler, of whom half were Scotchmen and half Shetlanders, whom we picked up at Lerwick as we passed. The Shetlanders were the steadier and more tractable, quiet, decent, and soft-spoken, while the Scotch seamen were more likely to give trouble, but also more virile and of a stronger character. The officers and harpooners were all Scotch, but as ordinary seamen, and especially as boatmen, the Shetlanders were as good as could be wished. Now, probably the best remembered single event in Shetland from this era is the debacle of the Diana, which in 1866, while on a whaling expedition in Baffin Bay, became trapped in the ice for over 6 months. The Diana, the Diana had been carrying provisions for only 2 months, and and by the time she limped into Runesvoe, 11 months after setting out from Lerwick, Captain Gravel and 7 others had died. Several others, despite reaching Shetland, didn't recover, and in total 13 men died, of which 9 were Shetlanders. There's a memorial fountain to the Diana in Lerwick. Now, Shetland Museum has a number of fascinating objects on this fateful ship. For example, we have this manuscript fragment with verses written by Alexander Robertson to commemorate the Diana's deliverance from an Arctic storm in the Sea of Greenland. Unfortunately, he was the last man to die after the Diana had reached Runesvoe. He died on the 6th of April 1867 after being given food by his wife, contrary to medical advice. This set of dominoes from the Diana is also at the museum. These belong to Lawrence Stewart from Yell, who was the harpooner on board the whaler. It's a very important job. There's also this sailor's ditty box, which contained a variety of oddments, including 5 polar bear incisors and 2 polar bear molars. It becomes quite obvious when you see this material that whalers love to have souvenirs to bring home. Now, this belonged to John Hutchison, who was born on Skerries. He was the half-deck boy on board the Diana. And this venerable old fellow in the photograph is the last survivor of the ship, Christopher Tate of East Burfirth. Now, the Diana is still remembered, but I think it's fair to say that in comparison to the more recent whaling experiences from the Antarctic and south of Georgia, the Arctic whaling days are slipping from communal memory, and the amount of surviving material is a diminishing resource. As regards material culture, the Shetland Museum has a number of artefacts which Jenny Murray kindly let me examine and photograph. However, I feel sure that there must be a lot of other material out there, and I think what I'd like to do quite soon after this is do a survey of Shetland attics to see what we can find. As for intangible cultural heritage, there's no one left alive to tell us what it was like getting frozen into the ice in Davis Straits, or dancing with the Inuit at Umanardrak on Baffin Island. However, the School of Scottish Studies online resource, the Kiss the Richies, provides some evocative material and some colourful old Shetland voices. So let's look at some of this stuff. First of all, let's look at the fascinating and varied material held in the Shetland Museum. This first object is a fid for splicing rope. It's made of walrus ivory, and we mustn't forget that particularly after the end of the golden era of whaling, walrus and seals were also hunted in huge numbers. For example, in 1898, the Terra Nova brought home to Dundee 750 seals, 250 walrus, and 26 polar bears. Here is one before said polar bears. This is a polar bear skin which was used as a rug in the main room of Islesborough House. According to the museum notes, around 1900, the skin was bartered in Andrew Smith's shop by a whaler's wife against the winter's shopping. Smith was a merchant whose premises is now occupied by the Shetland Times bookshop. This beautiful object is a pricker, which is also made of walrus tusk, walrus ivory. And it has a particularly attractive piece of rope work around the join where the handle is morticed in. There you go. And it's from Kierkegaard in Olderfurt. But this particular object, also made of walrus tusk, is very interesting. It was donated as a fid, but is actually the tip of an Inuit harpoon. This part of the harpoon head, which would originally have been socketed into another piece of bone or tusk, and it goes into the animal, and then it comes off from the actual harpoon. And it was donated by the child of Magnus Anderson of Quayford, near Hollaberry. And just to show you how these things are attached, here's a harpoon head, an illustration of an Inuit harpoon properly socketed from the skin boats of Greenland, which is a rather excellent book by Peterson, which explains all about the different types of kayak used in Greenland. The museum also holds a whaler's harpoon. So this is an iron harpoon found during excavations near 86 Commercial Street, So it proves that sometimes archaeologists don't have to go particularly far back in time to find interesting objects. And this is a 2-flue iron with stop withers. Those little things are withers. And according to Captain William Scoresby, who wrote an account of his whaling campaigns, as it were, in 1820, he explains how these things worked. When the harpoon is forced by a blow into the fat of the whale and the line is held tight, the principal withers seize the strong ligamentous fibres of the blubber and prevent it from being withdrawn. And in the event of its being pulled out, so far as to remain entangled by one wither only, which is frequently the case, then the little reversed barb, or stop wither, as it is called, collecting a number of the same reticulated sinewy fibres, which are very numerous near the skin, prevents the harpoon from being shaken out by the ordinary motions of the whale. This type of harpoon was used before the mid-19th century, before the toggle iron was developed by a certain Lewis Temple of New Bedford in the States in 1848. Interestingly, the idea of a toggle iron may have been inspired by the Inuit. Now, I'd like to turn to the museum's minutiae of the title. It's an ugly little neologism that I made up, but it seemed to work. This is material made by the Inuits and traded with the whalers. These goods mainly comprise models of kayaks and sealskin pouches for tobacco. The first such object I'd like to show you is this kayak, given to the museum by the grandniece of poor old Captain Gravel of the ill-fated Diana. This kayak is likely to be from West Greenland, as the paddles and the kayak itself have bone parts at the ends, the tips. This was to stop the full-sized one, to stop the kayak and the paddles being damaged by the ice. The bows are also very highly curved, which also suggests a Greenland model. And the museum notes add that this type was called a vasisartop. I don't know where they got this information from, I don't know who they got the information from, and I haven't been able to confirm that this is in fact this type of kayak, but I'm on the case. However, they're absolutely right that it does come from West Greenland, because we have an ethnographical study of kayak types, and the closest match is with number 26 on the Greenland west coast. The red thing around it. It's not alone in the, I should say, here is a full-sized West Greenland kayak displayed in Dundee Museum, which shows how close the model is to the full-sized example. Unfortunately, Shetland Museum doesn't have a full-sized Inuit kayak yet, but who knows, under somebody's bed. Shetland Museum has a number of other model kayaks. Here's the side and top view of one. It's another beautiful example. Okay, that's good enough. And here is yet another. This is not from Shetland. However, I put it on to show that the kayaks were very common models, and you'll find museums all over areas where the whalers lived have examples. Kayak models, in fact, continue to be made in Greenland, and here's a model made in 1959, which is very like the Shetland example. Kayaks were clearly much favoured by the whalers as souvenirs, and when the Inuit occasionally made the journey across the Atlantic in person, they were frequently prevailed upon to display their kayak paddling skills. And in 1816, John Sakehouse, a stowaway from Disco Bay, entertained the people of Edinburgh with several feats of dexterity in his kayak at Leith. And in 1886, Uriel Wetwango did the same for the people of Lerwick. The museum also has a model of an umiak, a larger communal boat. But I'd like to turn from kayaks and boats now to the other word in the title, which is yakikash. Yakikash, an Inuit tobacco pouch. This is an illustration again from the book. The museum has 6. This one belonged to John Irvin of the Market Street Company. They're rather beautiful objects. This one was brought from the Davis Strait by Hugh Mackenzie, whose last voyage was in 1857. This one doesn't have any information about where it came from, but it's a beautifully made one, and it has illustration of people holding hands, I think. And this one was also owned by John Irvin, so he obviously traded with the whalers when they got back from his shop. But this is undoubtedly the most beautiful example. It belonged to George Linklater of Biosetter in Bressa, and he served on the whalers the Eclipse and the Eskimo. Thanks, Dan. And we actually have pictures of these particular ships. This is the Eclipse on the right. The Eclipse was built in Aberdeen in 1866, sailed from Peterhead, and there's actually a folk song, which I won't sing at the moment because I don't have time, which tells you about the Eclipse, and it seems to be written by a Shetlander, because the last verse says, "We'll tell him that we'll never sign again for 1 and 3, and we'll march through Commercial Street and sing the Jubilee." And here's a picture of the other boat that he was on, which is the Eskimo, built in 1863 by Alexander Stevens and son of Dundee. There's a fascinating account published in 1900 about one of her voyages to the north called The Cruise of the Eskimo, steam whaler to Davis Straits and Baffin Island, which actually records the trading exchange that resulted in the giving of these objects. Tuesday, May 16th, still blowing very hard from the northeast. So at noon we turned round and round into smooth water in Disco Bay. Sea, whoever that was, shot a seal. White whales seen going north. Having a mail on board for the governor of Godhavn, we steamed slowly to the entrance of the harbour and blew our siren, which brought off 2 boats full of Eskimo. Slippers, tobacco pouches, model kayaks, etc. were produced and duly procked or bartered for coffee, biscuits, old shirts and trousers and handkerchiefs. So we now actually have the recorded evidence of what was exchanged for these things. George Linklater also brought back a handbag of sealskin and a pair of baby slippers, smocks, and you can see the beautiful detail on this bag underneath. The last 2 objects that the museum has, which eloquently demonstrate contact between the whalers and the Inuit, are these 2 items. A killick, which is a soapstone lamp or stove, and a pana, a snow knife used for constructing snow houses. The killick is made of steatite, and the pana was found under the eaves of an old house in Stanihill. Here's a picture of a killick being lit, and the coat of arms of the territory of Nunavut, which had a killick in their picture. Now we're coming dangerously close to the end of time, so I'd like to just have a word or 2 about intangible cultural heritage which has survived. So I'll just quickly say this. Many words associated with whaling were borrowed by the whalers from the Dutch, and there's a whole range of them. The spekschner was from the Dutch spekschneider, the blubber cutter, who was the man who cut up the whale. But from the Shetland perspective, a very interesting word is krang, which comes from Dutch krang or carrion. This was the word used for what was left of the whale once the blubber had been taken off, and it's now used in Shetland as a word for like a sheep's krang, carcass lying beside the road. So I've heard it also used for a car lying on the side of the road, and I've also heard it's used for what's left after you've stripped a chicken. So it has come into the dialect. Okay. How are we doing for time? Couple minutes. Whaling brought people and cultures into intimate contact, often very intimate contact, and many illegitimate children were fathered on Inuit women. However, there were also other types of contact, for example, linguistic and musical. Many Inuit learned English, and several whalers became fluent in Inuit. For example, Captain Alexander Murray probably spoke good Inuit as he spent most of his life with his father in Cumberland Sound and other areas of Baffin Island. And it's likely that ordinary whalers also picked up a few Inuit words and phrases. And the School of Scottish Studies has several recordings of an old whaler called William Hunter, who was born in 1890 at Skellister in Nesting. And his experiences were recorded by Dr. Albert Hunter in 1966. And according to his account, he was on the Scotia in 1907 and caught some whales, and he had contact with the Inuit, and he could relate Inuit words to Albert Hunter, and so he knew the word for woman, which is kuna. Apparently it is a derogatory term, so maybe we won't spend too much time on that. He also knew the word for man, which is Isaacy, presumably the personal name Isaac. In another recording, he says that Kanawi was the word for a bear, not the more usual Nanook in the north. Tupik was the word for a hut, and Yaqui slippers were called kumaks. Now, Tupik also, there's a Tupik there. Tupik actually made its way into Shetland as well. From this old picture, you can see the Tupik in Sintlister. It's the hut on the side, so the whaler has named his hut after an Inuit house. Just to finish off, I wanted to say a little bit about whalers playing music, because we have some evidence of what are called Yaqui tunes in Shetland. And it's been said by Charlie Simpson that Yaqui tunes were actually composed by Shetland fiddlers and attributed to the Inuit, because the Inuit didn't have a musical tradition using instruments of their own. But in actual fact, there's good evidence that the Inuit, as well as being able to speak English and picking up all sorts of things from the whalers, also picked up the ability to play the fiddle and the squeeze box. And when they couldn't get hold of fiddles, they made their own. So this is one from Alaska, which is a copy of a Western fiddle. And from another extraordinarily interesting book, which is about the Inuit in the north of Baffin Island, in the north of Labrador, we actually get an account. So I'll just finish with this account. This is an account from Lucien Turner, who visited the Ungava district of northern coast of Labrador in 1889, and he noted that the only musical instrument which I observed among the people was a violin of their own manufacture, made of course in imitation of those they'd seen used by the whites. And he goes on to explain the old woman who was playing it. We even have the names of 3 tunes that are supposed to be Yaqui tunes in Shetland. They don't have Yaqui names. There's a Willifjord, Oliver Jack, and Hjogravolter. All these are attributed in recordings by Tom Anderson in the 1950s. But nonetheless, it seems highly possible that these 3 tunes were learnt by the whalers from Inuit who had developed an instrumental tradition based on hearing the whalers play, if you like, as a sort of circular inspiration from each other. And just to bring this to an end, a little bit of synchronicity. When I was in the museum 2 days ago, what did I see? I saw a kayak being brought in by Bill Williamson, who is the grandson of a whaler, and he was bringing it into the museum to find out more about it. So it's good evidence that there is material out there just waiting to be brought in. And just to show very finally that the Inuit and the whalers had this intercultural contact. Let's see if this works. This is a Yaqui tune, but not one from Shetland. Let's see if it'll play. It won't play. I may have to play it later. There's a very strong instrumental tradition now in Baffin Island where the Inuit play reels of their own devising based on Scottish and Shetland tunes. So, all that I'd like to say at the end is that it would be great if we could revive some of this material and find out what's left out there before it does totally die, and because it's one of the heroic and exciting eras in the recent past of Shetland. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Andrew. You might not know, but Andrew's a trained opera singer, so you should make him sing. Any quick questions for Andrew? We have time for maybe 1 or 2 for the next. No questions, I don't think, Andrew, unless you want to elucidate further.
I'd like to just comment. Well, as you know, I've worked in Labrador, and I'm just so interested in all this stuff, and I'm sure, obviously, of course, you know that in a museum in in Stromness, there's also loads of amazing stuff, and I've photographed all that just for fun. But you know, that's something.
Maybe we should collaborate.
Maybe we should collaborate. Good idea.
And if we can thank Andrew again for his wonderful presentation.